Welcome back everyone to Afrodo Reviews, and on this channel I help you decide, is that book worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? Well, that's what we're here to decide. Today's book is Shadows of Doom by Ed Greenwood. The first of the Shadows of the Avatar The first of the Shadows of the Avatar series in the Forgotten Realms setting, and the start of the era known as the Time of Troubles, lore-wise, anyways. This is a book following the ever-known Elminster, the ancient, powerful wizard who is among the chosen of Mystara, the goddess of magic, and is totally not a self-insert character for Ed Greenwood himself. There isn't too much to comment about the history of this book. I remember reading once an interesting tidbit that explains why magic has such a strong focus when it comes to the lore heroes in the Forgotten Realms setting. But while I was doing research for this book, I couldn't actually find the article stating this again, and I was unable to corroborate it. Wow, I really spelled that wrong. And I was unable to corroborate it with another source. Though I do blame search engines for that one because they are becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. Seriously, I spent a day trying to find a decent clip of someone going insane for my Redeeming Love review. A full day, because every time I would type in what I wanted, I would get completely unrelated subjects. It's like, hey, I'm looking for an eye twitch. I want a cartoon character with their eye twitching. The only videos it would recommend to me are scientific videos about what causes an eye twitch. In any case, let me head you off with a report card. Now let's move on to the cover. Now, the cover of this book is decent enough. It's one of those things where I'm going to have to admit is that this book is the first of a sequel series from the original Elminster novels, which I also unfortunately have not read. I'll explain more why later that I don't like doing this and why I feel it's a bad idea even in specific regards to this book as well. But to move on with the cover, and to keep that in mind as I critique it, this artist's rendition of Elminster on the cover weaving magic as he faces you is fine. Even in the context, though, it has some problems. For example, despite the fact that the premise of the book is about Elminster losing his magic, you would never know that by looking at it. And to be honest, once you look past the titular mage, it kind of becomes visual noise. Coming up on like the right side here looks like a wave of water, but then you notice like cackling energy as it goes up. It becomes bubbles, and then it kind of becomes a decorated wall of sorts. On the left side, you have what looks to be an orb of blue water, maybe, while you see Earth near Elminster's foot over here. I really hope I'm gesturing right here. I don't have a mirror. Or at least I think it's supposed to be Earth, as it's covered in speckles of green. Then again, that could be for Mage, or it could be meant to be there. As you can tell, this is a very old edition of the book. To put a fine point on it, it looks like an AI drawing almost. But I know that can't be true because the edition I have is a lot older than the plague of AI artists that's currently on the internet. The best I can figure is that it's either going for a purposely confusing visual noise to emphasize the chaos of magic at that moment, or it's going for a master of four elements sort of vibe. You know, sort of like Avatar The Last Airbender. But the latter makes less sense because it never comes up like that in the story. My only other potential idea is that it's supposed to represent how wild magic is becoming, but it doesn't feel right. But anyways, let's move on to the synopsis. To summarize, this book is going to be difficult, so for the sake of context, I'm merely going to read the back. It was the eve of the time of troubles, the chaos of spilled blood, lawless strife, monsters unleashed, and Avatar's roaming Faerun was still to come. Unbeknownst to mortals, the gods had been summoned together, and among them was Mistra. I don't know why I'm saying Mystara. Mistra, grown proud and willful in the passing eons. With the others, she was about to be stripped of her godhood. The secret of her power gave her an idea. She made certain preparations, looking always for one who would be her successor. But until that person's ascension, her power must be preserved. A lone mortal must carry the greater share of her divine energy until the power could be reclaimed. And it was the fate of this mortal to risk being destroyed, or driven wild, involuntarily and without warning. This was the occasion of Elminster's doom. Now, why do I say it's difficult to explain? Well, simply put, that context I just read you, the synopsis of the book I just read you, is not quite how the story plays out. In fact, it's not what most of the story is. But okay, let me put this to a metaphor that DMs would understand. Imagine you've crafted this perfect story with intrigue and interest that's meant to excite your players' characters and send them on their way, following the breadcrumbs you've left them. Along the way, you throw in some random encounters, keep the world feeling lively and travel feeling dangerous. And during one of these random encounters, you decide, you know what, I'm going to add a bit of flavor. This is a living world, and things are happening outside of the player's perspective, after all, right? Only, you realize too late that was a gigantic mistake. Now the players are obsessed with this random one-off encounter they dealt with, and you're struggling desperately to get them back on track while they chase this plot thread that was never meant to be more than a one-and-done situation. But each time you introduce another part to deter them, you only galvanize them to go deeper, watching as they go further off the rails in a desperate worry, and before you know it, this is the campaign now. Your carefully laid plans pushed to the side, crumbling to the dust. You're forced to embrace the fullest decision you've made. The players have seized control, and you are nothing but a puppet to their whims. That's basically how this book feels plot-wise. After Elminster loses his magic, you think a big focus would be into the investigation of that, or doing something Mystra wants Elminster to do. But a chance encounter with the Zentarum group after Elminster begins his quest leads to 250 pages of stopping the Zentarum from taking over the Dales. It feels like a diversion in the truest sense of the word, because this isn't a series of events occurring because of Mystra's disappearance, and magic is beginning to go wild all over. It literally feels like Elminster just stumbled into a random encounter and decided, I'm going to follow that thread. Which also somewhat goes against the whole point of the reason he stumbled into the encounter in the first place. Since the whole reason... the reason he stumbles into this encounter is because he's trying to leave his home in the Dales. Because he fears that if people hear Elminster the Great has lost his magical, godlike powers, him and his home would become the target of people wanting to prove their worth. After all, who would become more famous than the man who slew Elminster? Instead, he decides he's going to leave mysteriously in the night, as that always leaves the lingering paranoia that he'll return, and still remains as powerful in the minds of his enemy as he was before he lost his magic. I kind of think abandoning that plan and storming an entire castle of Zentarum warriors with just himself and a ranger who joined him kind of goes against that whole plot, but whatever. Honestly, I'm not sure the story would have been interesting otherwise. I sort of joked in the beginning that Elminster was Ed Greenwood's self-insert Mary Sue character, as that's the common joke involving the wizard, even if you haven't read any of his books. And I kind of see why with this book. Elminster's just a little too perfect. He has several women who fawn over him throughout the book, with at least 4 here, though to what degree the fawning is supposed to be romantic can be debated, basically all over him. I mean, at least, there is at least an argument to be made maybe about 2 of them, due to, maybe archaic senses, and maybe this is just Elminster's platonic way of greeting his friends, but he locks his lips on a lot of women. That's all I'm going to say. When Elminster loses his magic, and every single person we are supposed to like turns and cries over the tragedy of the scenario. And furthermore, to expand on that, even though the entire premise of this book is Elminster is losing his magic, and now has to struggle to survive without it, you never actually feel like Elminster lost his magic. That's because he's so overloaded with magical weapons, items, and baubles that at no point does Elminster feels like he's been depowered. He clashes with several wizards who haven't lost their power, including several, martial warriors, and comes out on top several times with magic. If we were watching him slowly deplete his magical stash to the point where at the end he has nothing left and is being kicked around by someone he could have easily stopped by his magic, then this whole scenario would have been more forgivable. But no. All the items he used have almost infinite uses. And by the time Elminster's magic does return to him, it never once felt like we actually saw him struggle without his magic. As much as I say that he's a boring Mary Sue character, it's not like any of the other characters of this book were all that interesting to compensate. The two Harpers that are sent to protect Elminster, Belcrum and Ithar, felt like virtually the same character. I actually thought they were brothers for the longest time until they gave their backstory being completely different. And on top of that, they're almost a little sociopathic in this book. Actually, most of the heroes are, as they often joke while killing people. But that's kind of one of those, I think it's just, it wasn't meant to come off like that. It's sort of like in D&D, you always make jokes while, your players are freaking if you play D&D, you know that players come off as a little sociopathic if you would have believed they were actually in their character's shoes. But the two main villains felt very flat and boring, both receiving anticlimactic deaths. I actually had to go back and reread the whole section in the book where Helidor Longspear is killed because the book just so casually states, oh, now he's dead, and then moves on without a second glance. The only villain that has any form of staying power in this book is Manchun, the leader of the Zentarum. And that's only because he survives the book and is implied to be a greater scope threat from the Zentarum. The only one who... And that's also because I do know who Manchun is from modules and outside sources beyond just this book. The only one who felt semi-interesting to read about was Charantir, the ranger I mentioned before and who often goes by Char. But even then, her personality doesn't leave a lot to hang on to. She's mostly there to be Elminster's companion, in a sense. Now, it would be unfair to me to mention this without, of course, admitting that this is my very first Elminster book, which might have something to do a bit with my disconnect with the characters. Now, I've mentioned my dislike for a starting series anywhere but the very first book, even if it's like the book I have is the first book in a sequel series. I almost always prefer to start with book 1 of series 1. But unfortunately, with the D&D lexicon, that's near impossible. You see, a lot of my D&D collection comes from scavenging throughout various stores I visit. And while I can find some of the more popular books, such as the Dritz series, with ease, a lot of the books seem to be out of circulation. Even with this book, if I'm reading the copyright data right, this is the 1995 first printing edition. But because of that, finding the first might not be viable for me in a while. But I bring this up because the book does sort of give off the air like it expects me to not only be familiar with Elminster as a person, but already attached to his character. The whole part where I mentioned that everyone who learns Elminster lost his magical powers is sure to break out in tears over it would make sense from the perspective I was already with Elminster from the beginning, and say I watched him fight tooth and nail from barely being like a level 1 wizard who can only cast a couple cantrips to this level 20 archmage that he was before this book starts. But since I'm not, I can only lament how poorly the book does to set up why I should be sad. Also, admittedly, I'm more on the martial side of the martial versus magic debate in D&D, and this book is so heavily magic, it's kind of funny. But that's something for another time when I can find that article that I was talking about at the beginning. For now, simply, 5 out of 10. Yeah, it's not a terrible book. I think its most cardinal sin is being boring more than anything. This book feels like a great waste of time for the most part. But there's nothing offensively bad, and it didn't actually get to such a point where the tedium of reading it made me want to put the book down and never read it again. I also acknowledge that the book probably reads better when I have prior knowledge about why I should care about this character, But other than that, it's not a terrible book, and it may just be coming off the heels of those Redeeming Love, because that was just an awful book. But it's just one I found really boring. I don't hate it, and I don't like it either. That's the 5. I think I've summed up my point well enough, so that when I ask the question, does it deserve Mount Doom? The answer is no. I mean, a little bit obvious. But again, it's not terrible, just not good. It's not something I would say, don't read this. In fact, like I said, I think that if you're attached to Elminster's character already, it's probably an interesting book. At the very least, you would have for some reason to be attached to what's going on. With that, I don't really have much else to say in my conclusion. I think I've pretty much said it all. So, just remember, with every book comes an adventure. And every adventure is worth having. Even the bad ones. See you later, everyone.